Let's start, I think. Um, my name's Sarah Friedman. I'm the managing editor of Inside Cybersecurity. We have Maura Bergen next to me, who's the House Homeland Security Subcommittee Director for the Cybersecurity Subcommittee. Brandon Wales, the Executive Director of CISA. Mike Flynn of the Information Technology Industry Council. And Drew Bagley from CrowdStrike. We're here today to discuss the 2022 Cyber Incident Reporting Council for Critical Infrastructure Act and the notice of proposed rulemaking that came out on April 4th. So I wanted to start with Maura asking you about the legislation that was put out, how that evolved over the past few years.
Thank you. So the history of CIRCIA really starts during the 116th Congress. There was a hearing that we had when Chairman Richmond ran the subcommittee, and one of our witnesses proposed the Cyber Safety Review Board. And Mr. Richmond turned around and said to my colleague, Alicia Smith, who Brandon stole, do this. And so we began to think about how he would do this larger Cyber Safety Review Board. And a critical component to that is giving the government access to incidents in real time. So we had incident reporting language in the FY, I believe it was 21 NDAA, but it was stripped by the Senate. That year, the SolarWinds happened, and then there was Colonial Pipeline, and it gave a lot of momentum for new cyber authorities for the federal government. One of the things that we identified as an issue was a lack of visibility on malicious activity on critical infrastructure, which is mostly privately owned. So we kind of took the stripped language out of the previous year's NDAA and started to work with the private sector and CISA and other parts of the government to refine the language and get it enacted into law. I would note that there were two principal goals of CIRCIA. First is to identify and disrupt cyber campaigns earlier, and then to identify the new tactics of our adversaries so that we could better prioritize investments to drive down risk. We picked CISA as the place for this authority to live because it had a strong history of collaborating with the private sector. Because it was an organization that relied on voluntary engagement, its most powerful authority was its convening authority, and it had a robust history of listening to the private sector and responding to what they say they wanted and what would be helpful. And as we deferred a lot of big decisions to CISA in a rulemaking process, we did it with the confidence that they would listen to and accept the feedback from the private sector about what would be helpful, how to streamline, what kinds of information would be helpful coming out of an incident reporting process, and really collaborate. And that was our chief goal. Now that NPRM is out, we're interested in continuing this engagement. We're interested in seeing CISA engage more with the private sector to further refine the NPRM. We can discuss more my views about what came out later on. But the goal here is to get it right and to make sure that there is a good, solid return on investment for what the private sector will invest in compliance. We want to make sure it actually draws down risk and we actually identify malicious cyber campaigns sooner. And we don't want the compliance costs to outweigh the benefit of the program.
Okay. Brandon, I wanted to see if you could tell us a little bit more about the implementation of CIRCIA and the NPRM and what's behind that.
Sure. So I think Maura laid out the background fairly well in terms of how we got to this place. So CISA got to the authority in 2022, and immediately along those lines, we start to engage with industry. So in the fall of that year, we held 27 listening sessions, both in person and virtually, around the country and with every single infrastructure sector to gather their initial thoughts and feedback, to listen to them. We also issued a public request for information and received about 140 responses from trade associations, individuals, and companies around the country on a list of questions that we had asked. And then we spent a lot of time working across the United States government over the past year, taking the information that we had received through those listening sessions in the RFI and crafting our notice of proposed rulemaking. And I'll say at the top, there's been a lot of discussion around the length of the rule.
It's not long enough.
I would agree. And about the amount of time people have to review it. We gave initially 60 days, although we just extended it to an additional 30.
Thanks for that.
I will note that when I got it to review twice during the full product during its development, I got one weekend. So industry has much more time than I did. But I think importantly, the rule is actually fairly short. Of that 470 pages, the rule is about 38 or so pages. The other 300 plus pages are really explanation. It is our thinking about how we ended up at the decisions that we did. Those are not the places, that's not the actual heart of the regulation, but it is explanatory. It helps to go into the details about what was our thought process, what were the alternatives we considered as we were making big decisions around things like what should a covered entity be, what should a covered incident look like, how should we consider things like this substantially similar reporting exemption. And so that preamble, all of that explanatory text is important for the readers to understand the context and to help give you a bit more information before you provide comment. So I tell folks, if you want to take an initial pass through the actual rule and places where you have more information, then start referring back to the preamble, as that will give you insights as you may not understand kind of how we ended up there. But importantly, this is a proposed rule. This is not a final rule. And so it is out there for public comment, and we want feedback, positive and negative. I think Maura is exactly right. The goal is to get it right, to craft a rule that maximizes the benefits and to the maximum extent possible reduces burden on industry, recognizing that any reporting is going to be some burden. What can we do to make sure that it is as minimal as possible to achieve the goals that we have? And I think Maura laid out some of those really well, but it's about spotting campaigns earlier. It's about being able to render assistance more quickly. It's about novel tactics and techniques. And it's ensuring that the government, importantly, has insights into what's happening across the entire cyber ecosystem, not only so that it can take action, but also so that it can understand the impacts of policy decisions that we make. Today, when the US government decides on various types of policy initiatives, we don't fully know the impact that they are having on the ground because we do not have consistent reporting across critical infrastructure. And we do our best trying to cobble it together through reporting from private sector firms and the limited amounts of reports that come into the government today, but that tells an incomplete story. And I think this will be an important tool to make sure that we are calibrating what we do better into the future.
Okay, thanks. Mike, I wanted to ask you about what the IT sector thinks about the NPRM and what CISA is doing in terms of implementation.
We would have liked to have known that we only needed to read 37 pages to actually understand what was going on.
You don't have to read any of it and just say it's great.
Oh, yeah, right. This is your first shot at this. There was a lot of interest in reading the whole thing and understanding it. I think from my member company's standpoint, there was obviously a great deal of interest and concern about, concerns may be too strong. There was a good deal of interest in the scoping questions. Understanding the volume of reporting that CISA was going to be ingesting, and then what were the processes, what were the technologies that CISA is going to be using to make sense of that data stream, and then turn it around, because I think Maura hit on it nicely. What is the ROI of the equation? There are more and more incident reporting, incident disclosure requirements. It's the kind of the regulatory tool of the moment in cybersecurity, at least in DC. There are more, but that's a major focus was certainly last Congress. What do we do as a federal government with all of that information? Because the information, the visibility on its own, doesn't make anyone more secure, anyone more resilient. So I think that's a significant, outstanding question. In the 448 pages, mostly context, it was a little light on that piece, and I think there's a lot to say. Maura has legislation in the works codifying the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative, the JCDC, a place where a lot of my member companies belong. Drew, I'm sure, has thoughts on it. Drew is at CrowdStrike with one of my member companies, my best member company, up on stage with me. And
for the record.
For the record, right. And I think there should be some serious discussion on how to leverage organizations like the JCDC, defensive planning activities, operational collaboration with this new data set that CISA is going to have from CIRCIA.
Can I jump in for 1 second? Because I think this is really an important distinction, is that there are a lot of incident reporting regimes out there today. But there's a significant difference between the majority of those incident reporting regimes and CIRCIA. Most of those incident reporting regimes from other regulators are there for accountability on the company that has had a compromise. They are for a regulator to understand why that compromise happened, whether that company was in some way deficient in meeting regulatory standards. CIRCIA is different. It is not about that company. It's about the ecosystem. So was that individual company going to benefit greatly from reporting to the government? No. But the information from that breach, from that incident, can help the broader ecosystem be stronger, prevent additional companies from being victimized from similar tactics. That's the benefit. And so we try to say, in the moment, today, you're not going to get a lot of benefit. But tomorrow, you're going to want other companies to be reporting, because that's when you're going to be getting the most benefit out of that. And I think that's the distinction between the regulatory program that we're operating from incident reporting, which is really about raising the cybersecurity baseline of the entire ecosystem, and other regimes which are really about accountability on individual companies.
To just add to that, I mean, I think the ecosystem that victims find themselves in today has 2 trends where threat actors are evolving and continue to evolve and innovate at a rapid pace. And then simultaneously, breaches themselves or cyber incidents are more and more regulated, and the security profession is more regulated. And so what you get is you definitely get a Venn diagram of overlapping reporting requirements, even though the intentions might be different. But you have something like CIRCIA, which is still telling a government agency about an incident, and then you have the SEC rules, which are having an impacted entity tell the world about an incident if it meets a threshold. And the threshold criteria, I think, in any of these, whether you're looking at these cyber-specific laws or you're looking at privacy laws that have an impact threshold too for breach reporting, you have a threshold that usually is focused on the risk to affected individuals or some sort of harm standard. And here, it'll be interesting to see where CIRCIA develops in terms of where the final threshold is. I know there's a proposed one in terms of how it's affecting critical infrastructure, because I think that it gets pretty interesting at the macro level, where you're seeing nation state actors. We can look at Vanguard Panda, and there's been, Director Wray was testifying before Congress about that a couple months ago. There's been these instances of critical infrastructure being attacked in a systemic way that might not otherwise be visible on a one-off basis. And that's where then government has unique authorities to then disrupt adversary infrastructure to do something with that information. So definitely curious in terms of, congressional intent there, as well as executive branch intent.
I mean, that is the specific. I mean, the new iteration of the incident reporting bill that Ms. Clark kind of carried the banner on was born out of SolarWinds, which we realized was ongoing for 19 months. We just didn't know it. And we wanted to have, some aggregator who had the ability to get data and then analyze it and derive insights that would lead to disrupting these sorts of events much, much sooner. That is certainly the congressional intent. I also want to comment on the Venn diagram of reporting rules. To be clear, when we passed CIRCIA, it was the intention of our members that this would be a streamlined reporting framework, recognizing that there are other reporting frameworks across government, but none of them I would argue this is one of the most important purposes of an incident reporting framework. This isn't about compliance. This is about disrupting and protecting an ecosystem, as Brandon mentioned. So, our goal, and we're hoping that other agencies will play nice with CISA, is to make CISA like the central hub without having people have to go to a billion different, or a bunch of different agencies to report. Rather, if CISA has a thorough form that can interact with other agencies, that CISA can share information in a timely way that meets whatever the agency's requirements are to streamline reporting, right? We don't want We don't want compliance costs and burning time filling out different forms to distract people from incident response. So I think that is also one of our goals, and to be clear, that was one of Congress's goals.
So on May 1st, the House Homeland Security Cyber Committee held a hearing on CIRCIA and got some perspectives from the telecom, banks, and
Open policy.
there was open policy,
Yeah.
right? Open policy.
They're a unique player in the space.
Yeah, some of the regulated industries. I wanted to ask Maura what your next plans are for oversight when it comes to this.
Yeah, I think there was bipartisan consensus that CISA should engage with the private sector to further clarify the definitions of covered entity and covered incident. As I mentioned at the beginning, the reason we put incident reporting at CISA was because it has historically had this unique convening authority, and it had engaged with the private sector really productively. And we'd like to see that engagement continue so we can refine the rule and help CISA continue to build the trust that it has built with the private sector over time. And part of that trust and maintaining that trust is being responsive to feedback. I think, having read many of the 450 pages, there were times in the rule that, a proposed rule, that a comment was they would summarize feedback from the private sector and then say, like, oh, but we're confident that technology can overcome this, or something else, or even maybe they mentioned something that Congress said and said we were told by Congress to consider this, but we decided not to consider it. And so I think we will have comments ourselves. Our members will submit comments for the record, and we are pleased that CISA extended the comment period by 30 days. We are hoping that CISA will do additional engagement with the private sector in whatever framework can be worked out. But again, our members at a bipartisan basis are committed to getting this right. Part of getting it right involves having the private sector be confident that the final rule will yield results. Because there's going to be bumps in the road when the final rule comes out. That is inevitable in a new program. No one should expect this to be, perfect the day it rolls out. That's not a reasonable expectation. But what you do need to have is the private sector have sufficient buy-in in the program that comes out that they can tolerate the bumps in the road as it continues to improve.
So, Bridget, I wanted to ask you to weigh in on the scoping of the rulemaking. You have the threshold for small businesses and then the sector-specific criteria. Do you have any plans to make any changes to that? Are you engaging with the community to learn more about what they think? And just want to get a better idea of what you're thinking about as you get more feedback.
So, it is undoubtedly the final rule will be different than the notice proposed rulemaking, and that will be the feedback that we receive as part of the notice and comment period will drive the shape of the final rule. And I think, as you note, and as Maura said, kind of I think the three most critical questions that we will get feedback on are the definition of covered entity, the definition of covered incident, and what is reportable, and what is required to be reported. And we expect a lot of the feedback will be in those areas. That was a lot of the feedback to the request for information in late 2022, and I think that'll be a lot of the feedback we receive on the NPRM. I can't tell you what that will look like because it'll be based on the feedback we receive, and in the final rule, we will have to respond to those comments. So it'll not be a black box in terms of what happened. We are required in the preamble to the final rule to say, many commenters talked about X, and here is how we are responding to that. So that is our commitment as part of the process, and we will be as transparent as we can be. But the most important thing is for us to get thoughtful, useful comments on those critical questions, because those comments are the ones that legally will drive our final rule.
May I add one point?
Yes.
There's a lot of attention on how can CISA get this right, and that's appropriate. I don't think people should, I think people should also hold Congress accountable. CISA has asked for investments to implement CIRCIA, and those investments are necessary, and they have not gotten the amount of funding that they have requested. So while yes, CISA should feel the pressure to get this rule right, Congress should also feel the pressure to fund it appropriately.
I agree with that.
So one of the things that
Consensus.
comes up when it comes to CIRCIA is the agency is moving from more of a voluntary role into becoming a regulator. You already have that for the chemical sector, but this is incident reporting.
Not anymore.
Yeah.
Not anymore,
Hopefully-
temporarily.
Hopefully temporarily.
I wanted to get Mike and Drew to weigh in on how you see this being, how CISA can kind of thread the needle with this and become effective when it comes to being a regulator and also its voluntary efforts.
Sure. As you're noting, CISA has held this very unique place amongst government agencies as being an agency that really has focused on that public-private partnership as part of its core mission, and that even predates the creation of CISA as its own distinct agency and goes back to NPPD at DHS. And so, I think that muscle memory is there. That's very unique. A lot of that takes place directly with the cybersecurity industry, but what's gone on, even deeper and even longer is that direct collaboration with critical infrastructure entities themselves. I think that's definitely something that's going to be, a bit challenging in a way. The thing that I would say would be, just maybe a formalization of what's gone on is already with those relationships, there's been an expectation that critical infrastructure is going to be sharing information with CISA in order to facilitate that sort of partnership. Now there's going to be, depending on how it all finalizes once the CIRCIA rules are final, there's going to be a structure in place, there's going to be mandates around it, and then there can be penalties for non-compliance. But I think that as Brandon was noting, it still doesn't change fundamentally the purpose for which CISA's collecting that information from these private entities. What is going to be a bit challenging or continue to be challenging is, again, this notion that some of these entities will be public and therefore also have SEC requirements. Some of these entities might have incidents that involve personal data and have some sort of duty to report to a state's attorney general office or a privacy office or whatnot. So you're going to see all of those things come into effect as well. And that's where I think it's particularly interesting to think about how what we start seeing on the back end with some of these agreements amongst federal agencies to share information with one another, to then have it so that if you have an affected entity, they have a cyber incident, maybe they have to report to 3 entities, they're only reporting the information once, and then CISA is able to share that. That apparatus, even if CISA now will play more of a regulatory role in some ways, that apparatus, I think, again, can be something that could be seen as a very positive development, because there's no way to wave a magic wand and undo over a century of unique regulations for all these agencies that have their own unique authorities and that their breach reporting comes from. But to the extent there is a way to treat something more like a common application where you submit it once and it can be shared on the back end, I think that's really important. And so I know that we'll see how the final mechanism works out, but the fact that that's in this NPRM, I think, is pretty promising.
Well, I think it's not just the final NPRM and how it turns out. There's conversations that CISA can be having now with their interagency partners to start a process where they can get the memorandums of understanding in place, right? As CISA is developing their incident reporting obligation, looking around at their partners and saying, these are substantially similar, or they could be substantially similar. How are you making our stakeholders' lives easier, not just in terms of the compliance burden, but the easier the reporting processes are, the more likely it is we will be able to realize the efficiency not only on the regulatory side, on the compliance side, but on the security side. The quicker you can report, the quicker you can respond.
I'd also add that in terms of the conversations that CISA can be having now, there are certain conversations that are covered under the proposed rule, but there are other conversations that aren't. And like to Mike's point, there's the conversations with other agencies about substantially similar reporting, but then there's also, earlier when I mentioned building confidence in what this framework will look like, there are conversations about what the technology CISA will be using to analyze data, how it will derive results. All of that, those are conversations that can be happening right now. Those are outside, in my view, the scope of the rule. And those confidence building exercises and activities, I think, are really, really important. So we're hopeful that those can continue. And I recognize that some of that is contingent, again, on congressional funding for implementation. So we'll keep
Could I
working.
jump in on that?
Yeah,
I think
sure.
it's such an interesting point because I think it's less well known, and Brandon can speak to this, but CISA already receives 1,000 more, annually. How many reports do you receive annually, and what do you do with that information? So some of the technical infrastructures in place and some of the processes in place to handle this new volume of incidents you're going to get from CIRCIA.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Mike. So I'll try to address a couple of the different themes that just came up in all three of your comments. We agree, in part because we think that if these all come into a central place, if incident reporting comes into place, that'll maximize our ability to do the type of analysis that Congress really wants to happen and that the industry would most benefit from. Now, there's a good model today, which is how it works for TSA's security directives and regulations around transportation-related entities. In their regulation, they require the reports to be submitted to CISA, and then we collect them, and then we provide them to TSA in near real time. So there are processes, and we are in conversations with many of the other regulators about that. And encouraging any new regulations to try to adopt this to the maximum extent possible. I think there may be some regulators that are leery prior to CIRCIA rolling out, despite demonstrating our ability to do this effectively for TSA. But hopefully over the time that will continue to improve and we can give them confidence that we can receive those reports. But we already do it today for both TSA and NERC. Now, we receive a lot of reports today. The vast majority of them come from federal agencies, though, under FISMA reporting, which is a fairly low threshold, far lower than there is in the proposed rule under CIRCIA. And we probably open up 130 to 150,000 tickets a year in our operations center for incidents that are reported to us. So the volume of reporting under CIRCIA will dramatically increase the amount of reporting we get from private sector, from industry. But in terms of the reporting over that we receive today, it will not be an order of magnitude difference, in part because we think that the threshold set in the NPRM is, and based upon what we have seen from reporting under the TSA security directives that also have a bit of a looser standard, and we receive more reports than we are likely to receive under the proposed rule, that kind of helps us to calibrate what we're likely to receive. So we're not necessarily concerned about the scale of reporting, but we are putting in place improved technology that will roll out long before the final rule does, that'll enable improved analytic work inside of CISA and improved information sharing, even with our existing interagency partners. So by the time the CIRCIA rule goes final and we receive the first official reporting under that regime, I think we're going to be very confident that that reports that come in will be able to move quickly to the agencies that are required to receive them. The conversations are underway with our interagency partners about questions related to substantially similar, about the requirements in the law that other agencies that receive information should provide it to CISA within 24 hours, irrespective of any other requirements. So we're beginning to lay the groundwork for that. Getting the proposed rule out there was critical so that we had something to compare existing rules against. And we've got a lot more work to do, but the team is driving forward every day, and we're not letting the fact that we got the proposed rule out there let us get complacent. And I just want to add one more important point, which goes to this question about, does this change the character of CISA? I'll reinforce again, the purpose of this rule is to turbocharge our voluntary mission. It is to give that voluntary mission more information to make it more valuable, so that when we provide advice, it's even better. When we provide guidance, when we alert people on campaigns, it's enriched by a greater body of information that's helping us derive good, positive outcomes. And that's obviously different than a lot of our other regulatory programs. But industry should also have confidence that Congress was thinking about you when they crafted this legislation and actually put in place very strict rules about how this information can be used. In some areas, actually too strict, and we have asked for changes because the information can't be used to prosecute the actual criminal who perpetrated the attack. We hope Congress does fix that piece, but the information that is received pursuant to CIRCIA cannot be used by any regulator to take regulatory action, any enforcement action against an entity. So, when you think about the character of CISA, whether this changes, at the end of the day, I don't think so. Because again, it's not about holding people accountable. The information we receive is never going to be used for enforcement purposes. It is only used to benefit the entire community, and that is how everyone in CISA thinks about it, and that is that is built into the underlying statute, and certainly that should come across in many sections of the NPRM, and Mike mentioned kind of enforcement. Anyone who's read the underlying statute knows that the enforcement mechanisms in CIRCIA are quite light. It is really just about giving us additional tools to get the information, not about penalizing. There's no fines and those kind of things that are really initially available. So this is really about kind of getting the information into our hands so we can do good with it.
I would just argue that the enforcement mechanisms, I wouldn't describe them as light. I know we disagreed about this, but I would describe them as mission-driven, right? The goal is for CISA to get the information, recognizing that the people who are compromised are victims of a crime themselves. That was not. I will also say though, like, if you blow off the subpoena, you can get debarred from federal contracts. It's not exactly a light punishment for many of the people who will be reporting. So there are consequences beyond that, but you really do have to run afoul of not cooperating with CISA to find yourself in that hot pot.
So I wanted to ask about the role of bidirectional information sharing. One of the things that industry has said quite a bit is CISA may not necessarily, or federal agencies may not necessarily provide information as quickly or that they want, or it's not as helpful or detailed that they need to have this information. I wanted to find out, I guess from all four of you, about how you think CISA can be most effective. You were talking about building the systems in order to be able to do this, but how can you try and make this so that it can be helpful to both industry and government?
I would just at a high level point out that we did contemplate this when we drafted the legislation, and there's a pretty express directive for CISA to engage with the private sector on the quality of the information it puts out, what they would like to see differently both with intake and with pushing information out. So again, CISA has, to its credit, worked hard to be a good collaborator and a productive collaborator with industry. We expect that will continue, and we expect that CISA will continue to engage with industry both during the rulemaking process, but also beyond that when the rule is final. I mean, like I said, when CISA first puts out its first CIRCIA report alert, something derived out of CIRCIA reporting, it might need to be tweaked, tailored, et cetera, to meet the needs of the private sector. That's to be expected. This is a new program, and it's an enormous undertaking. We can criticize CISA for the rule, or you can have criticisms of the rule, but also recognize it is an enormous undertaking. I think the mechanisms are in place to get the feedback so that CISA can continue to calibrate what it's generating.
Just wanted to mention, we have a few minutes for questions at the end. If anybody wants to talk, we have mics set up.
Drew can talk about this more intelligently than I can, but hit on this idea.
That won't stop you though, right?
No, it's not going to
Stop
stop me. I live in DC. The kind of turning, it shouldn't just be about information sharing. That is understandably a lot of the focus, right? But maturing, making a more robust, collaborative space to use this information, I think is just critical to making sure that down the line, CISA is able to generate the kind of defensive outcomes, the security outcomes that will keep industry really engaged, turbocharging that engagement. It's going to come not just from issuing alerts, issuing analysis, trend analysis. Folks like Drew do that kind of work now. It's unique authorities that the federal government has to make the ecosystem more secure by removing threat actor infrastructure, which is the easiest place for me to turn it over to Drew, because this is your bread and butter.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you can walk around all the booths and see all the 9 million companies that have some form of real-time information sharing going on through platforms, through threat intelligence and whatnot. And what goes into even creating that in the private sector are linguists, malware reverse engineers, experts on geopolitics, SOC analysts, you name it, engineers. And that is something that is not going to be replicated within the government. And instead, it really goes back to those inherent unique authorities. What is it the government has that's inherent and unique? And here, really under CIRCIA, when we see how the final rule shapes up, what you're going to see is you're going to have some sort of unique composite picture that's going to be unique, but you're going to have those unique authorities to convene entities and convene competitors together, like JCDC does, to focus on something mission oriented, and then to be able to raise the cost for the adversary. So, defenders naturally need to be focused on implementing the best techniques and processes. They're on the front lines and figuring out how to protect themselves. Can't depend on waiting on threat intelligence from CISA to do that. But it's going to be very helpful to know if something's part of a greater campaign that the government's seeing, but also to be able to figure out, okay, how do we raise the cost for the adversary so it's not as easy to target these water treatment facilities or whatever it is. And then similarly to security partners, technology partners, wherever they are in the ecosystem, government might know, oh, we think, looking downstream, we think this partner could help if they, shared X information with their customers that might not have. So if it's done in a very, specific way and not trying to replicate what's already done, that's going to be really important. I think we've already seen a lot of that, for example, with JCDC, where that focus is now in collaboration, whereas over a decade ago, there was this focus on sharing of indicators, for the sake of just, if you just share the indicators, good things will happen. And now I think there's been an evolution, because there's been an evolution with the technologies, the managed service providers that exist, et cetera.
Yeah, I'll just add that I think several of these points are really spot on, which is don't think about what's going to come from CISA just to be information and alerts, because we want to use this information to really drive change. And that's going to happen in a variety of different ways. Some of it will be very public, and it'll be in alerts and advisories that we push out very broadly. Some of it will be gathering this information, providing it to our partners so that they can follow the adversary infrastructure that's being used, or the information submitted as part of the ransom payment portion of this so that they can follow the money to try to find the bad actors and hold them accountable. Things like that. It'll be bringing in companies like CrowdStrike, like Mandiant, to have conversations about, hey, we're seeing this. Do you guys have something similar? Are you interpreting it the same way? And we have some of those conversations today, but this will give us a richer body of information to have those conversations and hopefully illuminate more things that we are not able to see today because of lack of visibility into key parts of the infrastructure. But we never operate kind of alone, and it's never just us just putting out information and thinking that this is the only way in which we want to engage with industry. It is really about using all the tools at the government's disposal, trying to maximize those that are really unique that we bring to bear, and where we benefit and where we need industry to help us because they have unique visibility, they have unique insights. We want to be able to match up quickly what we're seeing with what they're seeing. And I think that was a lot of the reason behind the creation of the JCDC is how do we bring together those companies in the cybersecurity and technology space that have the ability to see and operate at scale that no one in the government does is critical, and they're going to continue to be key partners in how we use the information gathered under CIRCIA to get the type of security outcomes for the entire community that we need and expect. But it will still be one piece of this, and we'll want to make sure that we are, and we're already working with every part of the U.S. government to make sure that we can use this information to advance our security interests, whether that's the FBI, Cybercom, or others.
So when it comes to the funding aspect, in fiscal 2024, CISA did not get the amount of funding it wanted for CIRCIA and implementation. And when Jen Easterly was testifying last week at a House Appropriations subcommittee hearing, she was talking about FY 2025 is a very important year for CISA to get funding and implement CIRCIA and have the resources that it needs. So I wanted to find out where things stand with that and what you want to see as you go through the budget process moving forward.
I think our position is relatively clear.
Give us
This
more
is
money.
this is a new program,
sure.
and Congress wanted us to do it. We think it's important. Congress thought it was important enough to pass, and Congress should fund us to do it. I think we have laid out a fairly compelling story about why we need additional funding, both to make sure that our technology is modern and capable of handling both the information and the sharing of the information and the analysis. That we need to make sure we have the right people on board to analyze it at scale. And we may need additional people in the field to take action and engaging with victims of these types of cyber incidents. The more money we get, the better we'll be able to use this program to its full extent. And so we are hoping that Congress provides the funding that we need. They haven't given us nothing, but they haven't given us all that we've asked for, and we will use every bit of the money that we have received to make sure that we are as successful as possible. But we do hope that Congress recognizes that this should not be an unfunded mandate for a really significant effort.
I would just add, when we were in charge, we did like double CISA's budget those 4 years. But beyond that, we recognized when we drafted CIRCIA that this would be an expensive undertaking. So early in the early days, when we were negotiating language with our counterparts in the Senate and with CISA, we asked them to start thinking about what this would cost them. So when they come out with budget requests, it's at our request. And certainly Democrats in our committee are very supportive of making sure that CISA gets the funding it needs to implement CIRCIA effectively. And I would hate for CISA's hard work implementing this so far to be undermined or frustrated by poor funding requests or poor funding allocations. It is really important, and Congress did give CISA this big mission, and it needs to fund it.
So I wanted to go into a little bit more about the third parties in the reporting process. There's been some comments in terms of you have companies like CrowdStrike and others who are providing services to companies and also providing intelligence. So I want to find out how you see third parties being part of this, and if there's a need to have requirements for them moving forward.
So I'll only add that the law allows companies to have third parties submit on their behalf. It doesn't quantify who those are. They just need to have the authority from that company to submit reports on their behalf. And although the company that suffered the compromise is still the one that is legally liable for submitting ensure that the information is submitted. I think if you look today, a lot of large companies rely upon legal counsel, outside legal counsel, to support their incident response. I don't know if they'll have third-party IR firms like CrowdStrike fill these out on their behalf. We're not, that's not for CISA to decide. We're laying out kind of the context and the obligations on the company that is ultimately responsible, and then they'll need to work with their service providers to make sure the information is submitted in accordance with that.
I think that's an important acknowledgement of just the way the ecosystem works. So generally, most of the incident response we do, we're working with our customers' outside counsel are coming in. So that's important that it doesn't disrupt the way it's actually done in a breach to allow for that.
I think it's also it's worth saying this is something that my members cared a ton about. Something we worked with Congress Maura and her colleagues really closely on, and I feel like we were really heard because earlier drafts of the legislation had different parties that were potentially responsible for making reports, which, as Drew says, is fundamental to the industry to keep that customer service provider relationship intact. It was a really good story, I think, for Congress working with industry stakeholders to understand the realities of the cybersecurity ecosystem and then realizing that in statute.
Okay. In the last few minutes, so if anybody has questions, we have 2 microphones. In the meantime, I wanted to ask you about the National Security Memorandum that came out last week. Do you see any ties to CISA's implementation of CIRCIA that you're going to be wanting to address as you move forward?
I don't know that there is a anything very specific, other than that I will note there are several places in the proposed rule where we discuss Presidential Policy Directive 21 or its successor documents. NSM 22 on critical infrastructure released last week is that successor document to PPD 21. And so that goes to questions related to the scope of critical infrastructure and the definitions of covered incident. That being said, the scope really hasn't changed from PPD 21 to NSM 22, so I don't think it'll have any type of substantial near-term effect, but there is a lot of work that's required under the new National Security Memorandum, updated sector risk management plans, a new national cross-sector risk management plan that will be worked on over the course of the next year. Those will help further refine out and define the community of critical infrastructure. So those may have some impacts on the margins, but I don't think you'll see any kind of sea change as a result of the new NSM.
Okay. Do you have a question? Can you identify yourself and your organization?
My name is Becky Brackett. I'm an editor of Mercury, and I cover this quite a bit. And so I had one question I wanted to clarify with you, Brandon. You talked about the information being shared with CISA being shielded from enforcement. How would that work if, in fact, CISA becomes the reporting body that then pushes things on to regulators? Isn't that de facto that information being used?
Yeah, so the distinction here is if you are required to report to an existing regulator under an existing regulatory program, much like TSA, that is covered by that regulatory program and can be used for any enforcement purposes that are required. Now, whether that other regulator requires the information to flow through CISA or directly to them, it would still be allowed to be used for enforcement purposes. What we're talking about here is only information that's required under CIRCIA, but not under any existing regulatory program. So many sectors that don't have existing sector regulations, if they report to us, it would be protected from being used in regulatory programs. But if it's required to be reporting under an existing regime, then no, it doesn't obviously have those same protections.
Great, thank you. And I just have one follow-up too for Drew and also probably for Mike. You
We
talk
need to be
about,
quick.
Excuse me?
Quickly, please.
Oh.
We're almost out of time.
Okay, well, I'll just ask it offline.
All right. All right, well, thank you all for your time. Appreciate you all being here. And looking forward to seeing all of your comments on the NPRM when it comes out.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Comments are due.